It was a quiet Saturday morning when the unexpected happened. Mark Williams, a 38-year-old man, woke up in his small suburban home, unaware that his life was about to change forever. The sun had barely risen, casting a warm glow through the blinds, and the house was peaceful. Mark had always enjoyed the calmness of his neighborhood, a place where everyone knew each other. But on this day, everything was about to shatter. As he walked to the kitchen to brew his morning coffee, Mark noticed something strange. He heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. He thought little of it. After all, sirens were not uncommon in a busy city. But just as he poured the coffee, he heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps outside his door. Before he could even process what was happening, there was a loud knock at the door. "Police, open up," a voice shouted from the other side. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what was happening. Why were the police at his door? He didn't think he had done anything wrong, but his mind raced with confusion. He opened the door cautiously. Before he could even speak, two officers rushed inside. They didn't introduce themselves or explain why they were there. Mark stood frozen, watching as they quickly moved through the house. His thoughts raced. Was there a mistake? Did they have the wrong house? "Where is he?" one of the officers asked, scanning the living room. "Where is Mark Williams?" "I'm Mark," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The officers froze. They exchanged a quick look before one of them spoke up again. "You're under arrest," the officer said bluntly, pulling out handcuffs. Mark's mind went blank. Under arrest? For what? He hadn't done anything wrong. But before he could protest, he felt the cold metal snap around his wrists. The world seemed to spin around him as the officers led him out of the house. Neighbors had started to gather, peeking from behind their curtains, watching in shock. Mark could barely hear the officer explaining something about a tip they had received. They mentioned something about illegal activity, but none of it made sense. Mark was a quiet, law-abiding man, always polite and respectful. He had worked hard to build a good life for himself, one step at a time. He couldn't believe this was happening. As the officers escorted him to the squad car, Mark noticed a few familiar faces in the crowd. Some neighbors who had known him for years looked on in confusion, unsure of what was going on. A few tried to approach, but the officers quickly blocked them off. The entire scene felt surreal. Why was this happening? Was it all a mistake? Mark's mind spun with questions, but no answers came. The squad car doors slammed shut, and he was driven away from the only life he had ever known. The truth about why Mark was arrested and why the police had raided his home would take time to reveal. But one thing was clear: the shocking turn of events had only just begun. Mark's world was about to be turned upside down in ways he could never have imagined. As Mark sat in the back of the police car, his mind raced with confusion. He tried to make sense of everything that had happened so quickly. What was going on? Why had the police come to his house? What did they mean when they said he was under arrest? Nothing made sense. He was just an ordinary guy, living a quiet life in a small neighborhood. Mark looked out the window, watching the city pass by, but his thoughts were miles away. He had worked hard for everything he had. He wasn't the type of person to break the law or cause trouble. In fact, he had always believed in helping others, doing what was right. He was the kind of person who believed in second chances and fairness, especially when it came to his work as a community officer. But this was something he never expected. The police officers in the front seat were quiet. They didn't speak to him, and he didn't feel like asking them anything. Instead, Mark sat back and tried to remember what led him here. He had joined the police force when he was young, inspired by the idea of making his neighborhood safer. Over the years, he had worked his way up, earning the respect of those around him. People knew him as someone they could count on. He had built relationships with local businesses, helped out in schools, and worked tirelessly to improve the community. But now, here he was, caught in the middle of a situation he didn't understand. He thought back to the last few weeks. There had been nothing unusual. Everything had been normal. He had no idea why anyone would point a finger at him, let alone send the police to his home. As Mark sat in the car, the officer's radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. A few words were exchanged between the officers, but Mark couldn't make out the details. It didn't matter anyway. The more he tried to think, the more questions piled up in his mind. Eventually, the car came to a stop. The officers led him into a small interrogation room in the local police station. It was cold, with a metal table and 2 chairs. Mark sat down, still in handcuffs, his mind spinning. He wanted answers. He wanted to understand what was happening. A few minutes later, another officer entered the room. He looked at Mark for a moment, then sat down across from him. This officer seemed more relaxed, less tense than the others. He was older, probably with years of experience under his belt. "Mr. Williams, I think there's been a misunderstanding," the officer began, speaking softly. Mark's heart skipped a beat. A misunderstanding. Was that it? Maybe this was all just a mistake after all. The officer continued, "We received a tip that led us to believe there was some illegal activity going on at your house. It turns out that wasn't the case. There's no evidence linking you to any crime." Mark let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. So it had been a mistake. His mind tried to process it, but there was still something off about the whole situation. "Then why was I arrested?" Mark asked, his voice calm but full of confusion. The officer hesitated for a moment before answering. "That's what we're trying to figure out, but I think you'll be surprised by what we discover." Mark's curiosity grew. What could he possibly be about to find out? The officer's next words would shock him in a way he could never have imagined. It was about to change everything. "You're the new chief of police," the officer said slowly, as if he were letting the weight of the words sink in. Mark's eyes widened. Chief of police. What was he talking about? How could this possibly be real? Mark's mind couldn't process what the officer had just said. "You're the new chief of police." The words seemed to echo in his head, but they didn't feel real. He blinked several times, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had always dreamed of making a difference, but the chief of police, that was something he never expected. The officer noticed Mark's confusion and smiled softly, trying to ease the tension. "I know this must be a lot to take in, but it's true. You've been chosen to lead the department. They just didn't have the chance to tell you before all this." Mark sat back in his chair, stunned. The thought of being the chief of police was so far from his reality that he couldn't even imagine it. He had spent years working his way up through the department, but he never thought it would lead to such a position of power. He had always been content helping in his own way, whether it was working in the community or supporting his colleagues. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Mark finally asked, his voice a little shaky. The officer paused, choosing his words carefully. "The paperwork took a while to process, and there were a few behind-the-scenes delays. But all that's over now. You're the new chief, Mark. It's just a matter of everything coming to light." Mark was still in disbelief. He had spent years working alongside the police force, but he had never expected to lead it. The idea of being the chief felt too big for him, too sudden. What about the other officers? Would they accept him? Would they respect him? The officer continued, sensing Mark's uncertainty. "Look, there's no doubt that you've earned this position. You've worked hard, and everyone knows your dedication to the job. This department needs someone like you, someone who understands the community and knows how to make real changes." Mark felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He had spent so much time trying to prove himself, working tirelessly to gain the trust of the people around him. He had always tried to be a good officer, someone the community could rely on. But being the chief was a whole new level. As the officer spoke, Mark's mind flashed back to his younger years, when he first joined the force. He had been excited and nervous, eager to make a difference but unsure of how. He had faced countless challenges along the way, from dealing with difficult cases to facing prejudice. But he had never given up. He had kept working, kept pushing, and slowly, step by step, he had gained the respect of his peers. Mark's thoughts were interrupted when the officer spoke again. This isn't just about the position. It's about the future of this department. You're going to bring new ideas, fresh perspectives. You can be the change this community needs. Mark didn't know what to say. His whole life had just taken an unexpected turn. One moment, he was a quiet officer in the community, and the next, he was being told he was the new chief of police. He stood up, still in shock, trying to wrap his head around everything. This is too much. I don't know if I'm ready for this. The officer smiled reassuringly. You're more ready than you think. We believe in you. Mark took a deep breath. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the challenges ahead, but one thing was certain. His life had just changed in ways he could never have imagined, and he was determined to rise to the occasion. News spread fast. By the time Mark left the police station, his name was already making headlines across the city. It was almost impossible to keep up with all the calls, messages, and news reports. Mark had always kept a low profile, focusing on his work and his family. He was the kind of man who enjoyed being part of the community, not in the spotlight. But now, things had changed. When he arrived back at his house, the neighborhood felt different. It was as if the whole street was buzzing with energy. People who had lived next door to him for years now looked at him with a mix of curiosity and confusion. Some waved from their windows, while others stepped out onto their front lawns to get a better look. Everyone was talking, trying to piece together what had just happened. Mark was used to the usual small-town greetings, a nod from a neighbor, a wave from the local shopkeeper. But now, it felt as if he was the center of a storm. He had always believed in the importance of community, and he had worked hard to be a good neighbor. Yet now, he felt like a stranger in his own home, a stranger with a title he hadn't expected. Mark, what happened? Called out Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who lived next door. She was standing at her gate, her hands on her hips, looking concerned. We saw the police cars. Is everything okay? Mark smiled weakly, trying to stay calm. Yeah, Mrs. Peterson, everything's fine. Just a mix-up. But I guess you could say it's all part of the job now. Mrs. Peterson raised an eyebrow. The job? She asked. What do you mean, the job? Mark hesitated. How could he explain what he had just learned? It's a long story, but I'm the new chief of police. Mrs. Peterson's eyes widened. What? The chief of police? You? Her voice was filled with surprise. Well, I'll be. I never would have guessed. But you know, Mark, I've always said you had the right kind of heart for it. Mark felt a strange mix of pride and disbelief at her words. She wasn't the only one in the neighborhood who was shocked. He had built his reputation slowly, quietly, one good deed at a time. But being the chief of police was something no one, including himself, had seen coming. As Mark made his way into the house, his phone rang. It was his brother, Jason. Mark, man, what's going on? The whole city's talking about you. Chief of police. How did this happen? Jason asked, his voice filled with disbelief. It's a long story, Mark replied, sinking into his couch. But somehow I ended up in this position. Jason was silent for a moment. You've worked for this, Mark. You've always been the guy who did the right thing, who cared about the people. Maybe this is your time. Mark didn't respond right away. He was still trying to wrap his head around the idea. He had always believed in doing the right thing, in putting the community first. But now he had to leave an entire department. He knew there were a lot of people who didn't trust the police, who felt that they had been let down by the system. He wasn't sure how to fix all that, but he knew he had to try. Later that evening, Mark stood in front of his bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection. His thoughts were filled with doubts. Was he ready for this? Could he truly make a difference? The weight of the responsibility felt heavier than ever before. But then he remembered the words of his neighbor, Mrs. Peterson. You have the right kind of heart for it. Maybe, just maybe, she was right. and maybe he could be the kind of leader the city needed. The days that followed Mark's unexpected appointment as chief of police were a whirlwind. His phone never stopped ringing, and the pressure of the new role weighed heavily on him. Everywhere he went, people asked questions. Some were supportive, others skeptical. But no matter how he felt inside, Mark knew he had to stay calm and focused. He had just been handed an opportunity to change things, and he couldn't let fear or doubt stop him. As soon as he stepped into the office for the first time as the chief, he was greeted by his colleagues. Some of them were familiar faces, others were newer members of the department. There were nods of respect and a few awkward moments, as if they weren't sure how to approach him now that he held the highest position in the force. But Mark wasn't interested in making things formal. He wanted to make real connections, to earn their trust, not just rely on a title. His first day was filled with meetings. There were policy reviews, discussions about the department's budget, and countless documents to sign. But Mark knew that the paperwork wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was how he would lead the people in this department. He couldn't ignore the challenges that the police force faced, especially with the tension between law enforcement and the community. Mark had always believed in fairness, and he wanted to bring that belief to his new role. At lunchtime, Mark sat down with Officer Carla James, a longtime colleague who had worked with him for years. Carla had always been a no-nonsense kind of person, and Mark trusted her opinion. "I know this is all new to you," Carla said, taking a bite of her sandwich, "but don't forget where you came from. The people out there, they need to see you as one of them. They need to know you understand their struggles." Mark nodded, taking in her words. He had always tried to be approachable, to show the community that he was more than just a cop in uniform. But now, as the chief, it felt like the stakes were higher. He had to find a way to unite both the department and the community, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. "Thanks, Carla," he said. "I won't forget what I stand for. I just need to figure out how to make it work on a larger scale." The rest of the day was spent meeting with other officers, learning about their concerns, and discussing the department's current issues. Mark listened more than he spoke, trying to absorb as much as he could. He quickly realized that while there were many good officers in the department, there were also many challenges that needed to be addressed. From complaints about outdated equipment to concerns about improving relationships with the community, there was a lot to fix. The more Mark heard, the more he understood that this job wasn't just about managing a police force. It was about setting a new direction. He needed to create an environment where officers felt supported, where they could do their jobs without feeling like they were being judged by the public or their peers. And he also needed to show the community that the police were there to protect them, not to be feared. That night, as Mark drove home, he reflected on the day. He had always dreamed of making a difference, but now the responsibility felt heavier than ever. He had to lead a department that was often criticized, but he also had to win back the trust of a community that had been hurt by law enforcement in the past. The road ahead was unclear, but Mark knew one thing for sure. He couldn't do it alone. Tomorrow, he would take the first step. It wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to try. He had earned this position, and now it was time to prove that he could be the leader the department and the community needed. Mark woke up early the next day, his mind already racing with the challenges that awaited him. The reality of being chief of police had finally begun to sink in. He knew he had a lot of work ahead of him, and the pressure was starting to feel overwhelming. As he sipped his coffee, he reminded himself that this was what he had worked for, even if it came in such an unexpected way. By the time Mark arrived at the police station, a buzz filled the air. The department was busy with its usual cases, but today felt different. There was a sense of anticipation, even tension. Officers whispered in the hallways, and Mark noticed that a few people avoided eye contact when he walked by. He understood. He had been one of them once, just a regular officer, not the chief. It was a big change, not just for him, but for everyone else too. As Mark walked into his office, the door swung open, and Officer Carla James appeared. She looked serious, her usual smile replaced by a concerned expression. "Morning, Chief," she said, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of worry. "There's something you need to know." Mark raised an eyebrow, motioning for her to sit down. "What's going on, Carla?" She took a seat and looked at him carefully. "There's been a lot of chatter about your appointment. Some of the department is excited, but there's also a lot of doubt. People are talking about your experience, or lack of it. They're wondering if you're really ready for this." Mark nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. It wasn't just about having the title. It was about proving himself. He had been a respected officer, but now he had to show that he could lead, and that wasn't going to be easy, especially with some people doubting him. Carla continued, "There's also the legal side. Some of the officers involved in the raid at your house, well, let's just say there's some fallout. They're facing questions, and there are rumors about misconduct. It's becoming a mess." Mark's heart sank. He had never imagined that the raid, which had been a simple mistake, would lead to such complications. He wasn't angry at the officers. He knew they had been following orders. But now, their actions were under investigation, and the department was facing scrutiny. This was the last thing Mark needed on top of everything else. "I didn't ask for this," Mark said quietly, his voice filled with frustration. "I never wanted to be in the middle of a scandal. I just wanted to do what was right." Carla gave him a sympathetic look. "I know, but now you're going to have to deal with it. The department needs your leadership, especially now. You can't let this shake you." Mark ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the responsibility press down on him. He had always wanted to make a difference, but he had never thought it would come with this much pressure. He had to lead the department, handle the fallout from the raid, and restore the public's trust in law enforcement, all at the same time. Later that day, Mark sat down with the department's legal team. They outlined the steps that needed to be taken to address the situation. It wasn't just about the officers involved in the raid. It was about the public perception of the department as a whole. There were new policies to review, investigations to manage, and meetings to arrange with city officials. Mark couldn't help but feel a little overwhelmed. He had always been the one to fix problems, not create them. But now he had to face this head-on. There was no turning back. "I'll handle it," Mark said to the legal team, trying to sound confident. "I won't let this department fall apart." The next few days were filled with meetings, phone calls, and endless paperwork. Mark was determined to keep the department moving forward, even if it meant dealing with all the mess that came with it. He knew that the real challenge was just beginning, but one thing was certain. He was in this for the long haul, and he wasn't going to let anyone down. Not his department, not his community, and not himself. The media attention was unavoidable. Once the news had broken that Mark Williams was the new chief of police, the city was abuzz with questions. News stations, reporters, and local blogs all seemed to be watching his every move. They wanted to know everything about the man who had come out of nowhere to lead the police department. At first, Mark tried to ignore the cameras and microphones that followed him around. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. But as the days passed, it became clear that he couldn't avoid it. Everywhere he went, reporters were waiting to ask him questions. Some were respectful, while others were more forceful, eager to get a soundbite or make headlines. It felt like the city was watching him closely, waiting for him to make a mistake. One morning, Mark was walking into the station when a reporter approached him. She was holding a microphone and had a camera crew in tow. "Chief Williams, can you tell us how you plan to change things in the department?" she asked, her voice full of expectation. Mark paused, feeling the pressure mounting. The last thing he wanted to do was give a quick, rehearsed answer. He had learned over the years that people didn't want cliches. They wanted honesty. He took a deep breath and answered, "I want to restore trust. I know the relationship between the police and the community hasn't always been easy, but I'm here to make sure we do better, for everyone. It's not just about enforcing the law. It's about showing people that we're here to protect them, not intimidate them." The reporter nodded, but there was a look of skepticism on her face. "That sounds good, Chief, but how can we be sure things will change? How do you plan to prove that the department is changing?" Mark wasn't surprised by the question. He knew the public's trust would take time to rebuild. Words were easy, but actions were what mattered. "I understand that it won't be easy," he replied, "but I'm committed to making it work. I'm committed to transparency, to listening to the community, and to holding my officers accountable. If we make mistakes, we'll own up to them. But we're also going to work hard to show that we can do better." As he finished speaking, Mark could see that the reporter wasn't entirely satisfied. She thanked him quickly and turned to the camera crew, no doubt preparing for the next segment. It wasn't just one reporter. The media frenzy continued all week. The local news aired several stories about his appointment, and social media was flooded with comments, some supportive and others critical. Mark couldn't keep up with all the messages, but he read enough to know that people were watching him closely. Back at the station, Mark had to face the media's glare even more directly. It wasn't just about answering questions. It was about proving himself with every decision he made. The department was under a microscope. Every mistake would be magnified, every success questioned. He knew it was going to be tough, but there was no turning back now. The pressure of being the new chief of police was starting to feel like a weight on his shoulders. He had never asked for this kind of attention, but it was here, and he had to learn to live with it. By the end of the week, the stories about Mark's leadership continued to dominate the local news. Some praised his honesty and commitment, while others remained doubtful. But Mark had made one thing clear to the public. He wasn't going to shy away from the challenges, whether the media liked it or not. He was determined to make a real difference, and he knew that the road ahead would be long. As he sat at his desk late that night, staring at a stack of papers, Mark thought about the future. There were many hurdles to overcome, but he was ready to face them head-on. He had come this far, and now he had to prove that he could lead with both strength and compassion. The media might be watching, but he was focused on what really mattered, making his community safer and earning their trust, one step at a time. Mark's first few months as chief of police were filled with challenges he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about managing the day-to-day operations of the police force. It was about making changes that would improve the relationship between the department and the community. The road ahead was long, and the pressure was constant, but Mark knew he couldn't back down. He had to prove that he was the right person for the job, not just to his officers, but to the community he had always tried to serve. One of his first moves was to address the issues within the department. Mark knew that there were officers who didn't fully trust him, and there were others who resented his sudden rise to power. He didn't expect to win everyone over overnight, but he was determined to create a culture of transparency and accountability. He started holding regular meetings with his officers, listening to their concerns, and asking for their ideas on how to improve the department. At first, the meetings were tense. Some officers were hesitant to speak up, unsure of how their new chief would respond. But Mark encouraged open dialogue, creating an environment where officers could voice their opinions without fear of judgment. Slowly, the atmosphere began to change. Officers started to see that Mark wasn't just a leader who barked orders from behind a desk. He was a leader who cared about their well-being and was willing to make tough decisions for the good of the department. One day, Mark was sitting in his office when Officer Carla James, who had been with the department for years, came in with a concerned look on her face. "Chief, we've got a situation," she said. "There's been an increase in complaints from the community. They're saying that some of our officers are still using excessive force. It's not every officer, but it's enough that we can't ignore it." Mark felt a knot form in his stomach. He had been working so hard to rebuild trust, but this was a setback he hadn't expected. Still, he knew that ignoring the problem would only make things worse. "Let's meet with the community leaders," Mark said, standing up. "We need to hear what they're saying and figure out how to fix this." The meeting with the community leaders was tense. Residents were frustrated, and some were angry. They had seen too many instances of police brutality, and they weren't going to let the department off the hook easily. Mark listened carefully, asking questions and taking notes. He didn't try to defend the officers involved, nor did he make excuses. Instead, he acknowledged the pain and anger in the room and promised that the department would take action. "I know this won't be fixed overnight," Mark said, his voice steady. "But I promise you, we're going to do everything we can to prevent this from happening again. We'll hold officers accountable, and we'll train them to handle situations better. I'm committed to making this right." As the meeting ended, Mark felt a mixture of relief and determination. He knew it wasn't enough to just apologize and promise change. He had to follow through with actions. He immediately began working on new training programs for officers, focusing on de-escalation techniques and improving communication with the community. Over the next few weeks, Mark implemented several new initiatives. He created a community outreach program where officers spent more time engaging with residents outside of their usual patrols. He also introduced a new system for reporting complaints, making it easier for the public to file concerns about police behavior. Slowly but surely, the department started to improve. The community's trust began to rebuild, and even some of the more skeptical officers started to see the benefits of Mark's leadership. Mark knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time since becoming chief, he felt like he was making real progress. As he sat at his desk one evening, reviewing the department's progress, Mark smiled to himself. He wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but he had taken the first steps in proving himself as the leader the department and the community needed. And that, in itself, was a victory. Months had passed since Mark Williams had been appointed chief of police, and the challenges of the role had only grown. But with each passing day, Mark found his footing. He knew that he wasn't just leading a department. He was helping to shape the future of the community he had always loved. And that was something worth fighting for. One afternoon, Mark stood in front of a crowd at a community event. It was a gathering to celebrate the progress that had been made in rebuilding trust between the police department and the community. People from all walks of life had come together to mark the changes, and Mark felt a deep sense of pride. He had never imagined that his journey would bring him here, but now that it had, he knew it was worth every difficult moment. As he spoke to the crowd, Mark felt a sense of responsibility wash over him. "I know we still have a long way to go," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But together, we're making progress. We've started conversations that needed to happen, and we're taking real steps to change things for the better." The crowd applauded, and Mark felt a warmth in his chest. He had come a long way from the man who had been thrust into a role he never asked for. And now, he stood as a leader who had gained the trust of his community. The road had been tough, but with every action, Mark was proving that leadership wasn't about titles. It was about the impact you made and the people you served. Later that evening, Mark sat in his office, reflecting on everything that had happened. He remembered the early days of his career, when he first joined the force, full of hope and determination. Back then, he had only wanted to help his community. Now, as chief of police, he was learning that leadership meant more than just making decisions. It meant inspiring others, building relationships, and earning trust. His phone rang, and he picked it up to hear the voice of his mentor, Captain Davis. "Mark, I just wanted to check in and tell you how proud I am of what you've done," Davis said. "You've turned this department around. I know it hasn't been easy, but you've stuck with it." Mark smiled, grateful for the words of encouragement. "Thanks, Captain. It hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. You've earned the respect of your officers," Davis continued, "and you've started something that can't be undone. The changes you've made will last, even when you're not there anymore." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He had never been in this role for the accolades, but hearing his mentor's words filled him with a sense of accomplishment. "I just want to make sure we're doing the right thing. It's about the people, you know. It's about making sure they feel safe and heard." "Exactly," Davis replied. And that's the legacy you'll leave behind. A department that listens, a department that cares, a department that works for everyone. As Mark hung up the phone, he looked out the window, seeing the city lights twinkle in the distance. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than it had been. The department had come a long way, and he had been part of that change. It was hard work, and there were still battles to fight, but Mark knew that the foundation had been laid for something better. As the years passed, Mark's leadership would be remembered not for the title he held, but for the lives he touched and the changes he helped bring about. He had proven to himself and others that anyone, no matter where they started, could make a difference if they were willing to put in the work. And that was a legacy he could be proud of.